everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How is everyone doing? You exhausted? You exhausted all the time? Wonder what could be the root cause of that. Living in a collapsing empire. Anyway, there's your patented Andy Beckerman Beginnings intro dystopian thought of the week. And now to move on to our episode with the wonderful Linda Smith. If you don't know who Linda is, I'm going to read you her bio right now. While musician and home recording pioneer Linda Smith had started playing out in New York in the late 1970s, it was really when she returned home to Baltimore that her artistic life blossomed. Starting in the late 1980s, she began recording what is now known as bedroom pop and releasing her albums on cassette. Through word of mouth and distros like K Records, she gained a great deal of acclaim, and in the 1990s, labels like Slumberland, Shrimper, and Harriet began to release her albums. In 2021, Captured Tracks released an anthology of Linda's music entitled Till Another Time, 1988 to 1996. And at the start of March, just a couple weeks ago, they re-released two more of her early albums, Nothing Else Matters and I So Liked Spring, both wonderful and both well worth your time. This is cool. I've only been introduced to Linda very recently, but I really, really like her music. And the home recording DIY bedroom pop movement has been a huge influence, not just on, the music I make, which is not, I'm not famous or anything, but I like writing music. But also I think my entire life where, while I am here in Los Angeles and I do a lot of TV and film stuff professionally. I mean, not a lot, not stuff that gets made, but you know what I mean? I do make a living with a lot of it. And a lot of that is waiting for someone to give you a yes or no. Most of the rest of my creative life is very much, hey, I have an idea. I'm just going to do this because I want to make this piece of art, whatever it is, whether it's an album or a script or something like that. And Linda was at the forefront of that. And we really go deep into her childhood and look at some of these flashpoints for what made her want to be a creative person in the first place. And so, yeah, if you've never checked out Linda's music, you should. And I hope you like this episode. And if you do, what I like to do here in the beginning, in the start of every episode, is a little recommended if you like. Say you're a fan of Linda's, and you're like, well, I want to hear other people that might be doing home recordings that maybe you've talked to. Why, just last week, Mark Robinson, the founder of Teen Beat Records. Who else? Well, what about Dennis Kalachi, who is the founder of Shrimper, who has put out some of Linda's albums. Also, Trevor Campman, a.k.a. Holland, who has put out many albums on Teen Beat. Wonderful pop writer. Kevin Barnes from Of Montreal. Carl Blau. So check out those episodes. If you like what you hear, why not subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast from? Why not leave a review on Apple Podcasts or click 5 stars on Spotify? Spotify, terrible company. But I suppose as long as I'm not paying them for anything, I don't mind putting the podcast out there. What else? Got some cool episodes coming up, but I can't preview them because I have to record the episodes this weekend. And what if something goes wrong, as it sometimes is wont to do? Like someone doesn't show up to a Zoom, which has happened before. So I'll just say, stay tuned for some cool things coming up. But for now, let's talk to Linda. Do you have conversations with yourself? I'm asking this apropos of nothing, but just because I dropped my wife at, she's in a writer's room at the moment, and we only have one car. So I dropped her at work and came back home. And on my way in, there was like a pigeon on our lawn. And I just like offhandedly just said like, hi, Mr. Pigeon, or something like that. Something, and then I realized My neighbors can hear me. There were people on the street that could see me. But it was normal for me to just say an offhanded. I mean, I obviously did not expect well, you don't know that about me. You've just met me. You don't know anything about me. You don't know that for all you know, that I could have expected the animal to talk back or something like that. And then you would be very worried. You're like, what am I in for? I have to talk with this guy for an hour. So, but it made me think, I'm like, oh yeah, I spend a lot of time just kind of saying things out into the world. And I'm curious if you're this kind of person too, or do you keep everything in your brain?
No, I do. Well, I don't know. I always think of it as talking to myself, although I'm sure other people hear it. But I've been doing that for some years, and talking to inanimate objects and, people, usually if you're driving, you say something out loud, but the other people won't hear it. So, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Not always cursing or, angry,
sure.
Sometimes just a suggestion.
Yeah. But you said this for years, for a couple of years, you said. But so is this newish behavior, or is this something that you have always kind of...
Well, I think I've always done it, but it's getting worse.
Because I'm wondering, like, yeah, you're right. I wonder if it is a thing. I'm in my mid-40s now, and I'm wondering if I am just comfortable in myself enough that it doesn't matter to me. Like when I was younger, I might have cared if someone heard me say something. I mean, if someone saw me like emote something, it was embarrassing.
Right.
So to say a full sentence out loud was probably embarrassing too. And I wonder if I'm just comfortable in myself or don't care. Or I don't know. Have you thought about it for yourself?
Well, yeah, I have thought about it because I notice I do it a lot now if I'm shopping the grocery store and I'll just say out loud, where is that thing that I'm looking for? And maybe, I'm not talking to anyone in particular, but I am voicing what I'm, trying to accomplish. And I think it is something that's happened more as I've gotten older. Definitely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I don't see anything wrong with it. I think a lot of people do it. But I think it's just a way to kind of validate and focus sometimes, sometimes we need to do that.
Oh, I get the focus part when I'm really tired. So if I have to drive somewhere and I can't get out of it and I'm really tired, I have to like say to myself out loud, I'm like, green light, you can go through that. You're okay.
Yes.
As a way of like orienting me.
Right. So that, you aren't distracted all the time. There's so many distractions. I think sometimes you do have to just talk to yourself to get back on track.
Yeah.
Especially driving, that's very distracting.
I am curious though, like when you were younger, for me, I bottled up things because I was embarrassed about emotions. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, you're slightly older than me. And so I'm just like thinking about like you were born like in the mid 50s, right?
1955. Yes. That's mid 50s. Mm-hmm.
In Baltimore?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I'm just kind of wondering what, by the time that you were kind of conscious of the world, what was it like in general?
I think it's hard to remember back that far. Certainly, I think as kids, and I had 3 sisters, we weren't encouraged to be vocal. I think children nowadays are more encouraged to be vocal. As children, we weren't. That's just the way society was, and that's how you were raised from in the late 50s through maybe the 60s when things kind of got crazier with rock and roll and stuff. But and people, you get older, you have some things you want to say, and but as children, I think in schools there was a lot less tolerance, say, for expressing opinion.
Yeah, that's what's always seemed to me. Again,
it's true. I think so. It's very true.
How did your parents end up in Baltimore?
Well, they're from Baltimore.
Okay.
That's where they were born. So that's where we were born.
Okay, so how far back then? Generations? Like where does the family come over?
I guess it originated. That's a little hazy, but originated in the 20s, late 19 teens or whatever that time was. But yeah, there are a couple of grandparents who came over from, say, Italy or Ireland. Great grandparents. So. A lot of it's hazy. I don't have exact dates. My sister would probably fill me in more on that because she investigates these things, but through genealogy and things like that. But yeah, they were here a while.
So they come over when the great Irish and Italian kind of migration over here.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Where they become cops, whatever.
Well, yeah, various things. In that times, women who came over were homemakers. I mean, they didn't get jobs, except maybe they did in World War II came around or whatever. But no, the men had jobs of some sort. I wish I knew more about that. But it wasn't. It was a whole different setup.
Yeah.
Especially for, I guess, immigrants, their parents, their grandparents, however far back that went, they just were in a new country trying to establish themselves as citizens. And, that people are still doing that now. And it takes a few generations to establish and to feel part of the bigger thing here.
Well, did you feel that by the time that you were born? Did you feel American you're American in the golden age, post-war,
Mm-hmm.
the bargain that the middle class made to become the middle class, to become consumers, go from labor to we are now consumers. That is our consciousness. And this is the golden, we now have 40 or 50 years of a golden age that for us, that was you, right?
I guess. I mean, when you're a kid and you're born into a certain time period, you're not really sure what that time period is in relation to the big time period. I mean, since then I can see, mid to late 50s, a very distinct time period. And then the 60s start, and then you're in a whole other realm. And it's, from 1 to 5, I would say I was not necessarily aware of the social construct or the era as it was, except that I did watch television as a child, and I liked Mickey Mouse and Disney programs and certain other things I remember from television at that time, but I wasn't necessarily aware of the political climate or anything until later.
Did your dad fight in the war?
He was in the Navy, but I guess during the Korean War, but he did not participate in it.
What was his job in general?
I think, he had something to do with his job after that, and maybe during that. I wish I knew more. He's not alive anymore to ask, but at the time when he left the Navy, he worked for a company doing HVAC work, and that's what he did pretty much throughout my childhood as an independent, self-employed person mostly, fixing air conditioners, things like that. So it's a very kind of working class job.
Did your mom work?
No. We were still in the 1950s setup.
Right.
For a long time.
Right. So you grew up in a fairly working class home, or was it by the time in the 50s did it move into middle class? What was the kind of economic circumstances?
Well, I would say I said it, sort of in the mid to through late 60s, 70s. It was what you would call middle class. I mean, these days the middle class, people say there is no middle class, and certainly as we knew it then, probably there isn't, because things have become so separated out.
Yeah.
And but I would consider that middle class. They bought a house.
But
we went to schools. They had cars. I mean, that's middle class.
But that's the thing, like,
As
right?
it was.
Like, I wonder now if like a single occupation household with the 3 children. You said you had 2 sisters?
3. So it's 4 altogether.
Oh, you had 3 sisters. So 4
sisters.
children, 1 occupation. Like today, I think that would probably be impossible for a kind of like.
Everybody I know, it's 2 income households now. I mean, and even if one has a fairly good salary, there's still 2 incomes. I mean, unless you are, up there in what they call the 1% or whatever it is now, 1%, 2% of the people who can live on that, but they're actually living on something beyond an income. Those people, capital gains, things like that. But I mean, as far as like regular people coming and going to work, they need the 2 incomes, no matter how big they are.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, I asked this just because I'm wondering, and we'll get into this more as we keep talking, but I'm kind of curious as to what the horizon of possibility was for you in terms of your life, right? In this kind of what I'm calling the golden period of America, right? A somewhat what we would call now working class background, though with an income that puts you squarely into the middle class. What does life offer you in Baltimore? As you're maturing. So like now, in this question, like, we're into the 60s, like you're thinking about like what your life could be. And I'm kind of curious, what do you think about?
Well, I think through, as before I was living on my own and, was still at home, my idea was always to be an artist of some kind. And I knew that was not what was considered a money-making career. So I don't think I had probably the same career ideas as some other people of the time period. I didn't, and I never did really feel like I wanted a career. So everything I just view things very differently, and even the idea of a music career was not something I thought in the professional sense. I never saw it in that way because I always had jobs that were separate from making music.
Right.
I think that for any young people of the time, say the late 60s, early 70s, what was possible was very different for men than from women, especially back then. I think even, it still hadn't worked itself out completely as to what options there were.
I mean, second wave feminism is hitting, I guess, around the late 60s or so, early 70s?
Early 70s,
Is that something that you're conscious of at the time?
Yes, because I graduated high school in 1973, so I was certainly aware of things by then, and political upheavals. I had watched the end of the 60s on television like a lot of people, and I could see what was going down. And, but as far as being politically involved myself, I was never, someone who joined political groups or anything.
Did the tumult of the times touch Baltimore, really? Was it anything that you could see around you?
Oh, yes. And in 1968, when Martin Luther King was shot, we had riots here in the city. And that you can still see the results of in the inner city. And things are slowly changing. But there's still that aspect in pockets of the city that erupted then in 1968, and it was a very, very 1968 time here too. I can send you probably some articles about it, but I remember it quite clearly, and I remember going to at least one an event that they held every year in downtown Baltimore. And I forget what exact year, but once that happened, there was much more protest, I'd say, happening at public events. And there's an event here called the Flower Mart. And at that time, it was just an event in the center of the city to sell flowers and other items, and it was held by a ladies' auxiliary. And I remember going to that one year, and I guess it was the late 60s, maybe 68, maybe 69, maybe even 70, I don't know. But from 1968 on, things really changed. And there was some kind of disturbance there. Mm-hmm. And everybody said, oh, my goodness, and so they had to, there's a disturbance. People were throwing things and protesting, and the police are here. And I remember going to get on the bus to go home, because we took the bus down, and seeing a whole line of police in riot gear, basically, walking up the street, which that had not ever happened in Baltimore. So the Baltimore was very much affected by the late 60s and what happened.
I ask this just because, right now it's starting to feel a little 1968 in the world.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'm an adult now, so it's not really changing me. I'm already where I am morally, which is fairly far left.
Yes.
But I'm kind of curious about you, as you're an adolescent in this, does it change? I know you said you were not politically active, but does it change you inside?
Well, I think so. I think anybody who read the news at that time, of course, there were no social media, and we basically had newspapers and radio and what we saw on the TV news. And if you looked at news at all, you couldn't help but be aware. I think for me, seeing that, it certainly formed some opinions about what my political leanings would turn out to be. I'm liberal. I'm not conservative. And so to be at that age and to see that, I think that even if you aren't part of a group or a movement, so to speak, you always have, that it affects how you vote. It affects what you do when you go into the ballot box.
Mm-hmm. What about artistically? Right. What about I guess, let me ask this, and then we can kind of move through the decades a little bit. But what do you remember being your earliest existential desires? It doesn't even have to be artistic, just like what you wanted for yourself, if you even articulated it when you were younger.
Well, I have to say, in my mind, what I remember, and this was a cultural moment for a lot of people, that affected the entire 1960s musically and in many ways culturally, was seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. I mean, right there, I said, before that, I didn't, I was, that was 1964, so I was 7 years old, 8 years old, and I didn't have any ideas about what I wanted to do in my life, but it certainly gave me the idea that maybe music would be something to do, and but a lot of kids were affected that way when they saw that, and a lot of them went on to form bands, and just from seeing that show.
Yeah.
And that was kind of, I guess maybe you could call it an existential, unconscious moment that started something, but I wasn't totally aware of what.
Do you remember what specifically struck you? Because a lot of people, that is a flashpoint for them.
Oh, it is. It is for many.
And I'm just curious, I see it as like, it's in a documentary for me. I see like, screaming teenage girls, in the audience. And then what are they playing? Like, I Want to Hold Your Hand or something from like early Beatles. Like
that's what they were playing. Mm-hmm. For us, and, at least one of my other sisters watched it too. It was music that could be, we could call our music. It didn't come from our parents' record collection or their interest in music, which is totally different. And so I think that's what a lot of kids, young people, were drawn to it for. This is my music. I guess you could compare it to people who discover Taylor Swift now, and they're young, or they were young. I mean, Taylor Swift's whole thing started some years ago, but there are still people being drawn to what she's doing, and they feel like that's young people. They feel like that's their music, the music that speaks for them.
Yeah, that's kind of new too in that time period, right? Of a child differentiating themselves that drastically from their parents, because it seems like, again, this is just stuff I've read. Obviously, I didn't exist then, but like it seemed like before, from what I've read, a child was just some kind of like extension of their parent.
Right.
And you were the first generation where there were some kind of like real generational boundary.
I guess. I mean, there was Elvis before that, but I was too young to see Elvis on Ed Sullivan. So I guess there was the group before us who were drawn to rock and pop music from seeing Elvis, and Elvis was disdained by, the conservative people and the church and all this. And so they felt, this is our guy, Elvis. The Beatles, the Beatles themselves were that generation.
Yeah.
That's, Little Richard, Elvis, the 1950s rock and roll that was, I guess, it came out when I was born, the year I was born, but I was too young to have absorbed that. It took another almost 10 years for our music to come.
Yeah. So you see this and at least plant some kind of seed in your brain. Like, oh, this is a possibility.
Yeah, and I didn't even really realize what it might be, because I just thought, this is, this is something.
Yeah.
But I wasn't unusual in that. There were lots of people.
Yeah.
People who became famous later with their own rock bands. I mean, people a little older than me who saw it when they were teenagers, and I was not a teenager, but teenagers who saw it.
But I'm just like the idea that it could be something, but also, again, going back to something you said, there was this kind of patriarchal, I'm trying to think of what the word I'm looking for, atmosphere. There was a patriarchal atmosphere that also, in your mind, I assume, limited your possibilities. And so I'm wondering, how did these two things play out? Like, was it just through the 60s you were able to kind of like break through that, I don't know, glass ceiling, I guess I'll just call it, for lack of a better term at the moment?
Well, I mean, as far as, like wanting to do rock music, I didn't actually do anything until the late 70s. So, as far as buying a guitar and really, really deciding to do it. But, and that was as a result of the new wave punk, post-punk. But so it was like a second period of music that I felt like was mine, even though I was a little older. And, I think as a kid, I didn't really have, I just thought, I want to be an artist of some kind. I want to paint. I want to go to art school. I wasn't specifically thinking I was going to make music in the 60s. I just thought it would be great to be in a band like that. But I never really, I don't know, I never thought of myself as limited at that age from what I wanted to do, although, I didn't go to art school, or, I took some college classes later, but I had always thought I'd be a visual artist if I was going to be anything,
Okay.
Because that's what I like to do as a child and a teenager.
But where did that impulse get into you? Or even, if not just impulse, because that's just anything that most children do, the idea that this is something I could do. Like, did you see people around you making art for a living? Was it something one of your parents said, you can do anything you want and you can be an artist? Like, where does that get into your brain?
Right. I don't think it was, there was some encouragement to pursue that. But I didn't really have any idea of how to go about it, except to just, sit and paint or draw or whatever. I mean, I didn't know what the career of an artist would be. I knew about certain artists I like. Most of them were not contemporary artists. I was probably more interested in old style art at the time. But I think being an artist back then, even in that time period, the 60s, if a child wanted to be an artist, they didn't really know what the prospects were. They just knew they wanted to do it. Right. And I would say I wasn't tuned in at all to what the logistics of it would be.
Mm-hmm. So it's just like a vague notion in your brain, like, oh, I would like to do this.
Right. It's just like, I guess some people already have in their mind what they feel like they are. But they don't know how do you. They just try to do what they want to do, and follow that aim. But I think being an artist then, being a real artist as an adult who's out of school, whatever, very different than, say, way it is now. Mm-hmm. I mean, now it's much more, and at least as far as the art schools, what I can tell, it's much more designed in a way that people might be able to make a living doing it, like, say, teaching or something. I think a lot of artists teach to make a living in addition to their art, but I was never drawn to teaching. So for me, it was not about, I need to go to school and get a teaching degree so I can teach. I never even thought about it like that.
Okay. You just had this, I like this, I would like to do this. Then you see the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. You're like, oh, I like that. It's kind of, I'm just looking at the things that kind of like nudge you in a certain direction versus, right. When you're that young, I've talked to some people who are like, yeah, when I was age 5, I knew I wanted to be a painter. And I'm like, okay, mm-hmm. Great. I didn't know what I wanted to be for real until I was in my late 20s. So, it happens at different mm-hmm. ages for different people. And I think for most people that was just like little pushes in a certain direction that eventually can blossom. That's the real question I have for most of my guests, which is, what is the thing that eventually made you want to do this? Like, make art, make music, as opposed to it just being a desire that could have sat in you for the rest of your life. Do you know what I mean?
Well, like I said, for me, I was never career oriented, but I was oriented towards making art and music. And I don't know where those things overlap. I'll be 70 years old next year, and this is probably the first time in my life where I feel like music is some kind of, I hate to use the word career, but it is something I do because I'm retired from regular work now. And I don't know, it's always been there. And I don't know where the lines and the original idea came from, but I think most artists know they're artists when they're very young. They just know that. They may feel different in, say, typical societal environments like school, which is not, most public school is not, or any school when you're younger is not oriented towards art. It just isn't. You're being directed in another way. And I think that still happens.
For sure. It's a sideshow. Art's a sideshow.
Yeah.
When I was in school in the 80s and the 90s, it was part of a well-rounded education, but it was, very much math, science. Those are the things to do, and everything else is kind of just like, well, it's nice to have this to break up the math and science.
Right. It's more of a side light, and even now, I think, some schools don't really have art programs at all anymore. In the sense that public school in Baltimore that I went to had, so some have more and some have none. So you don't have a real support for I guess young people to explore that. And even when I was in school, though, it was never encouraged as a career or a serious occupation.
You said that, most artists feel different So my question then is, did you feel different when you were younger? Did you fit in? Did you feel alienated? Like, what was your place both in your family and in school, or whatever context you're in? I don't know. Did you go to church? Like, all this stuff, like, where did you fit in all these contexts?
No, I always felt pretty like an outsider in school. I also don't think that's unusual for artists because of what I said. You're not really encouraged to, to be. And I was a quiet kid. I wasn't somebody who spoke up very often, and so I just felt through most of my 12 years of public school, I just couldn't wait to get out.
Did you want to speak up and you felt that you couldn't, or did you just not want to speak up? Right? That's two different kinds of quiet kid.
Right. I may have wanted to, but I just felt too, it just wasn't, it wasn't something I could do in that context, because I guess around me, everything seemed so, in school, there's the whole idea of being, and at that time, being in a room full of 20 or 30 other kids, all also looking for attention of some sort, or trying to navigate that situation. Because to me, it was always a very artificial situation to place kids in. I mean, I didn't go to preschool, or we didn't have that back then. I didn't even go to kindergarten. So I didn't go to school until I was 6. And I was already kind of, non-socialized. Mm-hmm. Other kids, kids today are put in daycare or whatever. They're in a group situation before they even know they're in a group situation. So for us, it wasn't. To me, it was like being put in prison, and that's not even. I'm not even. It was. I just couldn't wait for each day to end because there was no. I didn't feel like there was any freedom there.
Okay.
It was all regulated, and everybody had to be quiet when they said you'd be quiet, and then you could only speak when they told you could speak. And then the lessons were boring. It was. I felt very bored.
Yeah. Yeah. I find a lot of public school to be uninspiring. I mean, probably a lot of school everywhere, except for maybe Montessori type schools, to be uninspiring. Right. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the function isn't to educate necessarily as much as it is to discipline.
Yes, it's to regiment a group of people, many groups of people, in all these little classrooms, to regiment them, so that they are prepared to be regimented for the workforce.
Yeah.
I mean, the workforce also, no matter where you work, unless you're running the show, is a very regimented situation. You have to follow rules. You have to follow this. You have to follow that. And you're not going to have an equal vote in what goes on where you work. And that's why I think that this is just an aside, but that's why we have all these unions starting. And I think that because you're not given that voice as an employee, no matter what you do, you just feel like it's a continuation of the school situation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was lucky in that I had a handful of teachers that were fantastic and that were there to educate and were really dedicated to it. Mm-hmm. Did you have teachers like that, or was it really just all prison guards?
Well, there were a few later in high school, who seemed a little bit more open-minded, and you're given a little bit more freedom to, say, write a paper about something you like, or, but I say most of elementary school, I can't think anybody and that I particularly liked who was a teacher. And junior high, that was, it's called middle school now, but then it was junior high. That was 2 or 3 years of what I could see was some kind of controlled chaos, and because of the age group that was in that situation. But when then you get to high school, you have a little bit more. Most of it was just sit down and be quiet kind of thing. That's just my feeling. you know?
Okay. Yeah, no. So, okay. So alienated at school. What about in your family? Did you feel a part of everyone, or did you feel like you were off on your own?
Well, yeah, I mean, we all got, you know, there were three other sisters, one who's a year younger than I am, and so we were closer, and we had some interests that we shared, and we did things, and we, you know, go out and play or whatever. But you know, that kind of starts separating it off during teenage high school times, and then people find their own friends or whatever. And do what they want to do. So it changes, I would say. And now it's kind of more back to, now we're all older. We all see each other. Everybody lives in the area. So, but I'd say it's different at different times of your life.
Yeah. But I'm just trying to get a picture of, like, you know, did you have any outlets? Like, okay, alienated at school, you're close with your sisters, but then as you get into teenage years, everyone kind of goes, you know, and has their own little friend groups. You know, are you bottling everything up? Do you get a chance to talk to people? Like, where, or, you know, how is there any context where you can be capital Y yourself?
Well, when I would paint. And I painted throughout that. That was encouraged. I didn't have a lot of encouragement to go to art school, you know, because we have one in city called Maryland Institute College of Art, but it was a lot more expensive, or not. I don't even know what it cost them, but it was more expensive than, say, going to a public or community college, and that's where I would have preferred to go. But you know, and so. But I'd say for myself, I could have probably figured some way to do that, but I didn't have the skills, you know, for that sort of endeavor to try to move forward the way I wanted to. And so I did end up going to a university, but it was not an art-based university. It was public university, and they had lots of art classes there, so I got to do that. There, but you also had to take required courses, which I wasn't that thrilled about. And
again, they're disciplining you.
So there's always this, you know, trying to go down this regular path to something that I was never really sure what.
Yeah. Okay. So they being just existence in general is trying to funnel you into a certain sluice. They're like, no, go this. And you're like, I don't know if I want this. I'm enjoying painting, but I find myself walking behind everyone else into this sluice.
Right. And I didn't really start to get to know other artists until much later. I guess it was the late 70s when I decided to start playing music. And I wanted to find people to play music with who kind of had that same, we can do this, we don't know how to play instruments, but we'll do it anyway kind of idea, which I found very, very attractive as far as being a musician. And because the kind of music that I was listening to then was not your typical high-end rock and roll corporate stuff, where they call corporate rock or whatever, but people who played and made big selling records. It was based on the music coming out of the Rough Trade label at that time, Raincoats,
right,
Young Marble Giants, Central Logic, Patti Smith even. I mean, Patti Smith herself was not a trained musician. And so when I first saw her on Saturday Night Live, I guess that was the late 70s, it was kind of like seeing the Beatles in 1964. It was like, it kind of reawakened this idea of doing something myself as an adult.
Yeah.
You know?
It's interesting that in the second half of the 20th century, how much of our desires are mediated in some way by television, right? Oh, because it's, you just mentioned these two kind of like iconic in your mind these iconic performances on TV, one on Ed Sullivan and then one on SNL in what, like
Yes.
76, something, somewhere around there.
76, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, right. That kind of like sparked this, that the seed is planted, and then, you know, what is it, like 68, like 8 years later or so, kind of like blooms into an actual like, oh, maybe I should do that. Is that how it
Right.
worked? Is that how it kind of like felt to you in your brain or in your body?
Well, I didn't really consciously get it until a little bit later. I just realized, oh, I was into rock, pop, listening to the radio all through my childhood, until around 1970 when I lost interest in what was on the radio. And you know, you can point to the Beatles breaking up and Diana Ross leaving the Supremes and things like that. But the sounds that were coming over the radio were different. And not to say they were worse, but it was just a whole different vibe coming out. And FM radio came in, and I never listened to FM rock radio, you know, and then, you know, what was going, I was not into the bands that were big in the 70s, Led Zeppelin, any of the singer-songwriters that came out. I just wasn't into it. And I don't know why. I couldn't continue in that vein. It was just not the same. And I wasn't even interested that much in the Beatles solo stuff because it
Sure.
wasn't the same. And so it was just like, I'm dropping this for a while. And I went and listened to the classical musical stations rather than rock or pop radio. And that was about 5 or 6 years, no, more than 5 or 6 years, I guess. More like 7 or 8 years.
Mm-hmm. So how does that lead to you finding out about, you know, the Raincoats or something like that? You know, this is all pre-internet, so someone has to introduce you to this in some way.
Well, with Saturday Night Live, I guess it was similar to Ed Sullivan. You just turned it on and you were watching it for, you know, just for amusement or whatever. And that time, everybody watched Saturday Night Live in the late 70s. They had all those people, you know, who became movie stars later on. But that was a very different kind of show then too. But sometimes you'd watch it just to see the musical act. But I don't recall really being aware of Patti Smith before I turned that on. And I just happened to see it, just like we just happened to see the Beatles. I mean, I just turned it on and I thought, what in the world is going on here? Because this was so different. And she was such a different kind of rock persona, especially for a woman doing this. And that is what kind of led me to investigate what was going on in rock music, following seeing that. And I'm not sure exactly when I got really full on into it, but I started to read the music magazines, the British music magazines. That's how, and you could buy those in your local magazine shop. There were places that sold magazines back then.
Oh, I remember.
And papers that that came from the UK, and that's how I kind of, you know, just gradually started finding out about those people. And then I started going to a couple of local record stores to find the records, and you couldn't pull it up on Spotify. You couldn't hear it on your phone. There was no phone to hear it on. There was no internet. There was no YouTube. So basically, I would read about something and I'd say, gee, this sounds like it's going to be interesting. I'm going to the record store and see if they have it. And I would buy it, and then I would take it home. And that's when I would hear it for the first time.
Linda, you talk about like, oh, you could go buy magazines. It reminded me when I was a kid, even through the 90s. So I don't even know when this shop closed, but in the strip mall that had the supermarket near my house, there was a newsstand shop that was as large as the Blockbuster next to it. So aisles of magazines, of comics, of newspapers that existed. That just
and you experienced that even at your younger age.
Yeah, that was still.
It hasn't been that long since the print media's kind of disappeared. You know.
No. Since you know, as the top people, either the 1%, the CEOs, whatever, are sucking out more and more money from these things and making them collapse. These things could be profitable, but are not.
No.
Or, are profitable, but just not at the levels that they want. So they all fall apart.
Right. Well, they shift. Some of it gets shifted to the internet, and, on the online magazines, blogs. It's just a different landscape for this. It's not.
Yeah.
You can't hold it in your hand. I ordered from the UK because I can't find them here. A couple of magazines that had articles, a review of the two captured tracks things, and there was an article in The Wire. But I couldn't. That was usually sold at Barnes and Noble, and we have a Barnes and Noble here, but they don't carry them. I couldn't find. They didn't. You could probably find them in New York City at that Barnes and Noble, but they didn't have it at this one. So they've reduced. Barnes and Noble used to be the place for a long time where you could find any magazine, the slick magazines, not indie magazines so much, but and now in this area they've really reduced it down to what's popular, what sells.
But I think that's what's interesting. When I talk to people who were born in the 50s on the show, your life parallels in some way the beginning. Like by the time you're an adolescent in the 70s, that's really where where the neoliberal age in America kicks in. And then especially as it intensifies through Reagan, right?
Right. Oh God.
And I'm always interested in how, one's own artistic beliefs and desires are filtered through, this kind of intensification of capitalism, this, as we get into at least, by the time that I'm in my 20s, into my 30s, it starts to be this kind of like, now we're stripping the copper wire out of the walls and, letting the rest of the house kind of rot. The stuff like in The Wire, when I think of Baltimore, I think of The Wire and, or the aquarium, which I visited many times when I was a kid.
Oh, okay. Are you from Baltimore?
I'm from Pennsylvania, so school trips.
Not far away.
School trips down to the aquarium, or like trips with my parents down to and I would just be you would never leave that little area that the aquarium's in. You would go to a restaurant.
The Inner Harbor. Yeah, the Inner Harbor was as far as anybody went if they were visiting here.
Yeah, but I'm curious, because but at the time that you are starting to kind of emerge as a public artist, there is this promise of that this is a real thing that could happen, right? That this is or I'm guessing.
I started to believe that just based on what I saw happening around me and what other people were trying to do. Baltimore had a very small art scene at the time, and back in the early '80s, I would say, and that's the people that I started to meet and work with musically. Some of them had gone to the Maryland Institute College of Art, but they liked playing punk rock, So there's still that connection between people who go to the art school and play punk rock, or like the Beatles, or the Rolling Stones. They went to the art schools there, and then they played rock and roll. So there's a connection there that's interesting that I don't know has ever really been explored, but. A lot of the bands who were in the UK playing their post-punk, a lot of them had been to art school or were in art school. So
because it was free.
But
that's the thing.
Maybe so.
It was. No, I've talked to many British musicians on the show, and who went to art school, and they're like, "Well, it was free, so I could go there and
very different.
Yeah. Whereas here you get saddled with debt.
Yes. And they had to pay those loans back from the Maryland Institute, or their parents did. Somebody did. But they're much higher now. So anybody doing that now is probably thinking more of, I need a career in graphic design or something. You know what I mean? So
Yep.
I'm not going to be a punk rocker.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people at the Maryland Institute now do music like it was back then. You know, I have no idea.
Yeah.
If that same relationship exists between the playing in bands and going to art school here anymore. I don't know.
I think it's diverged at this point.
I think so too. I think you're right. I think you're right.
To me, the archetypal American version of that is the Talking Heads, right? They all met in art school.
Yes.
But I think they all come from somewhat affluent backgrounds. And so that makes it possible.
At least middle class or upper middle class, my understanding is that they were able to either, you know, get loans or have their parents take out loans for them or have their parents pay for the whole thing at the time, you know. I mean, some people did have that happen where their parents were able to pay for it, but then they also had to fill out the forms so that they could get loans to send the kids there. It's so expensive now. But I don't know how they do it.
I think of David Byrne a lot because I'm like, he seems like a genuine weirdo.
Yes.
And
mm-hmm.
that is a very particular type that you can't be a weirdo like that and also working class. Because the filters filter you out from being able to do stuff. Because you have to, if you're a weirdo like that working class, you kind of like, there's no sluice for you to go through to become a famous artist necessarily. I mean, you can always be discovered. There's always possibilities. It's not like it's a closed system.
Yeah.
But to be a weirdo and that famous requires, you know, someone. I see it with comedians that I'm friends with. You need like because it's a business, so you have to navigate the business. You can't be a weirdo and navigate the business. So that means you have to have some kind of manager and agent that does all that stuff for you, and it just seems like it's more available to you. That kind of development is more available to you if you come from a more affluent background.
Probably so. I mean, it's interesting though that all these people who went to art school and then got into bands, most of them maybe just doing art for fun. Well, relaxation, they're not showing their work until maybe when they get older and they say, oh, I'm going to have an exhibit of my work. But that went by the wayside. The visual art kind of went by the wayside. And I mean, David Byrne, he might paint still. I don't know. I don't know what he did when he was in art school, but the reason they went to art school was because they were weirdos, and that was the only place they felt like they could feel at home because they would be among other weirdos. They didn't want to go to music school and have to learn theory and things like that.
Right.
No, that was just too restrictive. So you went to art school.
Right. But so in some way, you have this kind of mentality too, right? Or at least it feels like from what you've said, like, you know, you feel kind of like outside things.
Right.
You want to make art. It's maybe not available to you as a career because you don't come from a super affluent background.
Right. And I don't come from an art background either. You know, no one in my family is an artist. There's that. It's like you just kind of emerge from these situations that you didn't choose, of course, but you have to find a way to navigate that some which way. And whether it takes years to navigate it or you can navigate it and get to where you want to go right away is just, that's maybe dependent on your personality and your ability to do things that maybe get you a little bit further ahead. You know, the personality has a lot to do with it too. I think somebody like David Byrne, you know, he went to New York and started a band, or I guess his band started when he was at Rhode Island School of Design, and he was right there at the right time to put a band on the stage at CBGB. I mean,
Right.
God. So there's that kind of coming together of situations that he just landed right there in a time when people were looking for something different.
I mean, for you specifically, what was the thing that created the critical mass that made you want to express yourself in public? Right. Again, the differentiation I use on this is like there were, how many millions of people that saw the Beatles or that saw Patti Smith. What was it about you? What was the thing where you finally were like, oh, I want to write music. I want to do this in a public way. I want other people to see what I have to say.
Well, I think for me, just the basic idea after seeing each of those things on television was like, oh, this looks like a lot of fun. This looks like they're having a great time. People are cheering them. People are, they're getting the attention that's coming towards them, and the songs and the music was great. I like the music. It's this music is so great, and everybody looks like and there's nothing. What I want to say is kind of pre-designed about it or something, predetermined. It just seemed like this happened, and this is what happened. And say especially with the Beatles, they were turned down many times by record labels, I understand, or promoters or whatever. Until they found somebody that wanted to promote them and put them on television and sell their record. And Patti Smith, she started in New York City reading poetry. I don't know if she had always thought she was going to do music, but her poetry reading evolved into that when she got together with a guitar player named Lenny Kaye. So none of this stuff seems, originally, is not the kind of thing that I think any of them were necessarily planning on happening. Mm-hmm. What happened, it happened because of the situation they were in and who was around them and what the public was interested in at the time. I don't know if it's anything that was pre-designed or planned years ahead. So anything that I did I never had any plan. I was just kind of like, this is the moment. I want to be in this moment. I want to see what can happen from here. Uh-huh. We'll see where it goes. I didn't really see it in any success story way or anything.
Sure.
And I don't think either of them did either. I mean, either the band or Patti Smith did. They were maybe as surprised as anybody that they broke out in some way.
Okay. I think I have like one or two last questions then.
Okay.
When you started playing music, when you started playing in a band, when you started recording your own music, right? What did it fulfill in you where you're like, oh, this is, beyond the fun. I mean, maybe it was just the fun. Like, hey, this is fun and I need fun. Or what
Right.
was it where it suddenly was like, okay, this is it for me existentially?
Well, at that time, and I kind of got away from the whole band idea later when I started recording because I found that much more kind of satisfying as far as getting things done and so that other people could hear them. But I think the desire to be in a band was the desire to make a connection with others who wanted to do similar things, and to play out, and you have different aims at different times. I just thought, oh, it's great to get up on the stage here at the Marble Bar or whatever and play in this dirty old basement, and it's just so cool. There was this. It's so cool. And I didn't do it that often, but I did it once or twice in different places in Baltimore. And it was just, this was kind of like, okay, we've accomplished that. this is what we wanted. That's all I wanted at the time.
Well, then what kept you doing it?
Oh, that's a good question. I think even after I stopped really concentrating on live stuff, and it was still the connection you get when you release something and other people can hear it, and then you get response. When I started doing cassette tapes, I wasn't really performing very much, maybe once in a while, but I wasn't as interested in that whole activity. Anyway, so I just kind of at that point, I was kind of over I want to be in a band and play in front of people and stuff. I was more like, I want to write songs, and I want to record them so that they sound the way I want them to sound, and I want to put them out some which way. So in that time period, you could put out a cassette by yourself. It just happened to be the right time to put out cassettes.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah, sure. Last question. Mm-hmm. Do you know originally, maybe it's just a quirk of your biology of how your brain formed, whatever, but what made you, if anything, resistant to the sluice, I guess I'll call it, resistant to the sluice, if we're sticking with that metaphor, where you were like, this doesn't feel right, or school doesn't feel good. Was there, what was it about you that made you different from other students?
Well, I think maybe I said this before. I think people who are artists generally feel outside of their environment.
But about you, but I guess that's the thing. What made you want to feel like, what was that in you where you're like, this is who I am at the time? Does that make sense?
Well, as a child, I think you feel like this is this third grade's classroom isn't my scene. But what else are you going to do? You can't run away. You can run away from home, I guess. Whatever. You can't do anything. You just you deal with it, and once I learned how to read and write, I think everything was just not much interest after that. And and I think I already was seeing myself. I was always visualizing myself outside of that, and always. I just kept thinking, this is going to be over someday. I'm not going to have to do this. And now some people might deal with that by just not coming to school. I mean, there are lots of kids who don't want to be in school. You
Sure.
can't blame them. They might play hooky. They might. I wasn't so much of a rebel in that sort. I dealt with it, and I sat there, and I just thought there's going to be an end, and I tried to see that end coming, and. Like you would get a calendar and mark off the days till something, till something was going to be over or something was going to happen.
Yeah, very prison-y, very writing lines on the wall.
Yes. Well, that's why I compared it to prison, because there was that mental feeling of mental prison, physical too, because you couldn't leave. And if you got up and left, then you would get called into the office or something, and there would be problems. And I wasn't interested in causing problems. I just wanted to get through it, and then be able to be free to do something else.
Okay, so it's almost something primordial in you, in that, like, this is just how I was set up as I appeared on the scene in the 1950s.
Yes, this is where I happened to just land, and now I just have to get through it. I just have to deal with it. It's kind of like being in a job too that you aren't necessarily all that wild about.
Right.
But seeing that, I'll do this until that another point, and then I'll move on to something else. And just getting to the day that you give your notice, your 2-week notice.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, this, I think this is just, to me, it's like, well, artists certainly have difficulty navigating the setups that
For sure.
the society puts you in, and they deal with it one way or the other. However, and that may be personality based. Somebody who's a little more vocal and rebellious, they'd know they were not happy there. I mean, the school would know they were not happy there.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily going to know, a quiet kid who's just trying to deal is not happy. I mean, maybe they can see it, but they're not causing any problems. So I was somebody who did not cause problems, but others who chafed against that regimentation, I certainly have a lot of sympathy for them.
Linda, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been very interesting. I haven't had a chat quite like this before. So, I'll be interested to hear it when you edit it all together, and let me know.
Of course. Thanks again for this was such a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, great. And with you too.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye.